Hey, I'm Jared from EBMX. Today I'm running you through the throttle tuning on the X-9000. Almost lost me duck. Okay, so jumping in out, you've obviously got your dashboard. You want to go across to settings and you want to go across to throttle. There's a few options here. Basically, you'll see twist throttle functionality. This is where you can basically turn your throttle off, and that's if you damage your throttle in the field. And then with that, you'll come over to your thumb throttle and you can actually turn your thumb throttle directly to an accelerator. So I won't save this option now, but just remember that if you do damage this, you can use your regen thumb throttle, which on this bike, it's actually installed next to the throttle. You can use that as a backup throttle if you do damage this in the field. Next up in the throttle page, we have off-throttle regen. So basically what off-throttle regen is that when we're on the throttle, when we let off, what this means is it'll actually activate a little bit of drag or engine braking to the bike. So generally, I believe that the correct feeling is to have some drag on the bike. Nothing in anything in the bike world doesn't have drag. So I always feel like 5 to 10% is the correct amount of drag. I also like that when you're on a wheel stand on these bikes, that if you have that nice bit of drag, it kind of acts as a secondary brake for you essentially. So, but generally I would say a natural feel would be 10 to 20%. If you go up to 40%, I feel that's an unnatural amount of brake. It would be very close to a 4-stroke in the wrong gear essentially. So I think 10 to 20% is kind of the tops for me. Normally about the 10 to 5% is my preferred setting. So running back down the options here, we've already talked about the thumb throttle and how you can turn that on or off. So when you set up these bikes, if you get an error 18 or you get an error 24, that means that you haven't fitted the thumb throttle and that you need to turn it off in the app, and that would fix that and remove that error. If you do have one of the throttle errors, just remember that your motor will not calibrate either, so it's important to make sure those errors are cleared before you do a motor calibration or save those things in the general settings. So moving down from there, the most important one is ramping time. So what is ramping time? So if we imagine this is 100% throttle, so we've fully pulled the throttle, and this is obviously 0% throttle, so it's when we let go of the throttle. So what ramping time is it's how quick we basically get to 100% in milliseconds. So basically, as we adjust this ramping time, as we increase the time, it means we'll be slower to 100%, and as we decrease that time, we'll then be faster to 100%. So I hope that kind of gets a broad understanding of how that ramping time works. So personally, like on the bikes and the setups that I have, and a lot of my setups are 30 plus kilowatt, I really like a responsive bike. So for me, ramping time is generally set to 20 milliseconds. So, and to kind of go over that again, basically what it is, it's essentially your throttle sensitivity, and it's the amount of time that the throttle takes to go from 0 to 100% within the throttle curve. So as you lower this in milliseconds, basically the sensitivity or the speed of the throttle increases. So if you find your bike is too laggy or your response is too laggy, turning this down will increase your throttle response. Next one on for that is negative ramping time. So basically, to explain negative ramping time, as you turn off the throttle, it's how quick the throttle reacts to the off sequence. So 10 milliseconds I've always found is a good time. If you turn this down to 0, so a quicker off response, I feel that it just kind of feels unnatural, and if you increase it, I also think it feels like you've got a hanging throttle, so I recommend leaving it at 10 milliseconds, but feel free to play with it, but just remember that as you go up on the milliseconds, that you increase the amount of time it takes for the throttle to turn off, so it can be a dangerous one to play with. On that one, the next one that we have on our throttle setting is our input deadband. So what is input deadband? If you imagine that as you're going kind of down a track and your hand will actually naturally move because of the bumpiness of the suspension, etc., or the trail or everything you're on, what it means is the first part of the throttle where the controller basically ignores that input, and then after that, the controller will then action that input. So once again, it's a matter of like, it essentially puts some dead spot in the throttle where the controller doesn't action. Now, if you've got the stock Sur throttle or generally like a 3-volt style throttle, I would recommend that you leave that at 3%. If you have a throttle that is like a domino, which is 0 to 5 volt, you kind of have a little bit more allowance to add to 4% deadband, which means you have a little bit more movement before that throttle can start with still some really good throttle control. Okay, so moving on from that, what we have is input deadband. So what is deadband? If you imagine you go down a trail and your hand will slightly move on the throttle, what this is it basically means that the first part of the throttle has no action. So the controller won't accelerate in that first part of the throttle. And this is important because if you have a throttle that instantly reacts as soon as it feels a tiny bit of movement, it's going to feel really jolty down the trail. So having that deadband is a really important thing to have. If you have a 3-volt throttle, similar to the stock Sur throttle, 3% is the correct one. If you have something like a domino, which is a 0 to 5 volt throttle, you can afford to have a little bit more deadband because you have more voltage room to play with. So once again, definitely have some input deadband in there. 3% is correct for most of the stock throttles. If you have something like a domino throttle, you can go up to roughly 4% without kind of noticing any less throttle sensitivity. Okay, so now for the last two. So throttle Expo mode, this is basically the shape of the throttle curve. So essentially what we have is 3 curves that are predefined in the X-9000 app. We have a line, which is basically a straight 0 to 100. We have a polynomial, which is basically kind of like a flick or a tick shape, and basically exponential, which is kind of the other way. It kind of has a bit of a dip in the center before it goes up to 100%. So polynomial is definitely the one to go for, or line in my opinion. Exponential probably doesn't feel as good in my opinion. In some applications, it might be something you prefer, so it's definitely worth trying with the different throttles and trying with these different positions that you have. But I think polynomial is definitely the right one to have. And it's also a really hard word to say, so I hope I've said that correct on camera. The other thing to look at as well is your Throttle Expo. So this is kind of an important one, and this changes the shape of the end of the curve. This is a polynomial curve. Like I said previously, there's the 3 curves that we have. This is the one I prefer. It kind of gives you a nice control point if you really think this is roughly about 50% throttle at this point. When we increase the Expo, where we've obviously got this time, so if you look at this here, is milliseconds, we've got further time here. As we increase the Expo, what we do is we basically get to 100% sooner in this time. So a combination between increasing ramping time will get us to 100% sooner, as well as obviously decreasing our ramping time. And once again, if we want this to be slower as well, we can then take longer to get. We can actually make this graph out longer, and we can take longer to get to 100 if we decrease Expo. So if you want the end of your throttle to be more snappier, you'll increase the Expo. So 0.5 is something I personally run on all my 30 plus kilowatt bikes, but you want to make it a little bit less snappy at the top, so you would bring it down. You could go negative 0.5. So if that kind of makes sense, that the best way to describe it is as you increase it, it makes the end of the throttle more snappier, and as you decrease it, it makes the end of the throttle less snappier. And essentially it's just changing that curve, but only like the last quarter of the curve.
All right, so let's do some throttle tuning. All right, so Throttle Expo mode, we're gonna leave that at polynormal. I agree with Jared, that's what feels the best. All right, so deadband. Normally it's at 3%, that's what I'm used to. I keep the front wheel up at like quarter throttle. Let's turn it up to say 9. And let me show you what that does to the wheel stand. Or just the throttle control in general. So, if we pop the front wheel, I'm now like half throttle to keep it up. So I'm using a lot more of the throttle to keep the wheel stand up. So the power comes in later. So as you can see there, nothing, we're on. So in order to keep the wheel stand up, we're now gonna have to come back even further than that again. So to get it up, I'm almost full throttle. So that much deadband is really no good. Feels doughy, feels sluggish, and you got to use a lot more of the throttle resolution in order to keep the front wheel up. So that I'm happy with. Let's go back down to 3. I agree with Jared, that is a good value to be at. Now let's play with ramping time. It's at 10 milliseconds at the moment. Let's turn that up to 40 milliseconds. Let's see what that feels like. I don't notice a huge difference, but I'm not a person that's very picky on these things. I just get used to what I know. So let's turn it back down to 10. So this should be snappier in theory. Which it is. For something like wheel stands, that feels good. But I'm not really that picky. Like, I guess you could turn your ramp time up if you're on the track and you're trying to smoothen up those corners, etc. You might want to turn your ramp time up. 10 milliseconds to me feels fine. But that's my opinion. Yours might be different. You might have a complete different experience. So this is why you got to play with these things. Now, negative ramping time, I don't really feel the need to play with it. I will play with it just to show you what it does. But be careful, as Jared said, negative ramp time is the time the throttle releases. If you go down from 10 milliseconds, you're fine. It'll just be jerky on the let off. But if you go up from 10 milliseconds, that's where you enter the danger zone. So if you try doing a wheel stand, in my opinion, anything higher than 10 milliseconds, doesn't feel good because you do have a bit of hang on the throttle, so it's not really nice. All right, so let's go up to 30 so I can show you how that feels. I don't want to, but I'm going to. I'm not going to do any wheel stands because it's too dangerous. It just feels horrible and you lose all your confidence. Anything higher than 10 milliseconds doesn't feel right to me. You might be different. You might like a bit of hang on your throttle. So have a play with it at your own risk. But let's go back to 10. All right, so Expo. Let's turn it up from 0.5. And see how that feels. So this should be changing the top of our throttle curve. And we should be coming in sooner, so it should be more punchy at the top. You can definitely feel that. So now it legit feels like it's just flicking at the end of the throttle. It's like going from 0 to hero. It's like just giving you this little boot. Feels quite hard on the drivetrain. It's not smooth. It's this oomph, oomph, oomph at the end of the throttle. So personally, I'm going to turn that back down. So yeah, I found that a bit too jolty at the top. It wasn't terrible. Like, once again, I'd get used to that and it wouldn't bother me. But if I was going for smoothness around the track, I think it's a little too jolty. So let's go down. Let's go down to -6. See how that feels. Wow, it's very smooth, really smooth. There's no more punch at the end of the throttle, and you got to use more throttle resolution to keep it up. But I don't hate it either, it's really smooth. It's really smooth. The way it comes on now is not which my bike is, hence why I turn my bike down to 600 phase. Normally my bike is quite jolty because of the short swing arm, so turning that Expo down has actually smoothened the bike out. So just for a test, let's go up to 900 phase. I normally run 610 phase, especially off-road because it's more smooth. But now that I've changed the Expo, let's go up to 900 phase and just feel the difference. See if this thing is actually more controllable. It's very smooth. There's no jolt. Yeah, that's the best I've ever done a wheel stand. Wow, I've never had my bike feel so smooth at such a high phase. So we're now running 900 phase, 20 kilowatt. Before, especially off-road, that to me was uncontrollable. You'd be in corners and it'd be jolting you around the corner because often you get fatigued, so your throttle control gets less and less. But that's really good. I actually like that. -6 Expo. I like that. So there you go. Have a play at home. See what you like. Everyone's different. Thanks for watching.